Hello, BookTube! Welcome back to my 2025 library tour. In this episode, day 5 of Science Fiction and Fantasy Week. I have finished the 4 shelves on the other side of these two open ended shelving units that I use as bookcases. So I'm now starting this other side, which will be completed in 3 days: Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So let's get going. The first batch of books are going to be anthologies, which I will be keeping. And apologies if there are any wobbling, because the shelving units are not terribly stable. Part of the reason why I want to get rid of them. Now, first up is The Big Book of Science Fiction, edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. So, this is the first or second in a series of big old anthologies that the Vandermeers have put out in the last 10 years. This collects science fiction short stories from the days of proto-science fiction to about the early 2010s. This anthology came out in, I think, 2015. There's a lot of great stuff in here. Not all of it that agrees with me, although there are some stories in here that I actually did get on with. It's fairly global in scope, and I think argues perhaps for a more global science fiction and fantasy anthology at some point in the future. I also have The Big Book of Classic Fantasy, also by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. So, unlike the Big Book of Science Fiction, the Big Book of Fantasy is split up into 2 volumes: Classic Fantasy and I think Modern Fantasy. I don't have the Modern Fantasy anthology. So this includes works from, I guess you could say, proto-fantasy, through to the weird, with that genre that would eventually give birth to science fiction, fantasy, and horror as we know it today, and concludes with a short story by J.R.R. Tolkien. I have not yet gotten around to reading this anthology, although I have been meaning to for many, many years. But I will be keeping it, because when I decided I wanted to downsize my science fiction and fantasy collection, I determined that most of the anthologies I would keep. So the next batch of books are in part edited by David G. Hartwell, who was for decades a major editor in the science fiction and fantasy field. This first one is Sword and Sorcery Anthology, edited by Hartwell, along with Jacob Weissman. So this book includes Sword and Sorcery, which is a subgenre of fantasy in which a protagonist, usually a warrior of some sort or other, the sword, goes up against some form of sorcery, the sorcery. Sword and Sorcery was developed in the late 20s and early 1930s by Robert E. Howard, and it took off from there, although the popularity of Sword and Sorcery has never been perennial. There are ebbs and flows, peaks and troughs. And this anthology looks at the whole history of Sword and Sorcery, from Robert E. Howard and C.L. Moore to Michael Moorcock and Kenneth Lee, to more contemporary Sword and Sorcery writers, or some authors that aren't really Sword and Sorcery that are in here. There's think of I think there's an excerpt from one of the Song of Ice and Fire books in here, which is not sword and sorcery. Even if A Song of Ice and Fire is very low on the magic. Yeah, I think Path of the Dragon is sort of a novelization of, or an excerpt from one of the Ice and Fire books. The next three are co-edited by Catherine Kramer. The Ascent of Wonder, The Evolution of Hard SF. So this is a collection of hard science fiction short stories. Hard science fiction is a subgenre of science fiction in which the science is more the focus in the science is more possible than plausible or impossible. So I've dipped into this a few times, and I remember it quite fondly, even if my more recent attempts to read it have not gone all that well. I also have the hard science fiction, hard SF Renaissance, which unfortunately is marred by a gigantic used sticker. I'm pretty sure this was probably formerly used in a university class, because the stickers are very reminiscent of that. Anyway, so this is, I think, a more recent hard SF stories compared to The Ascent of Wonder, I would think. To not leave space opera behind, I also have the Space Opera Renaissance, which is in a much better condition. In fact, I think I bought it used, but it came with shrink wrap, so I'm thinking whoever owned it before me did not actually ever read it. So this includes a number of space opera, from space opera's beginning to roughly around the time this anthology was published, which I think was in the early 2000s. Moving further into the past, I have Weird Tales, edited by Marvin Kaye. So this includes, I think, stories published or republished in Weird Tales. The next two anthologies return to the Vandermeers. First up is the first steampunk anthology, which I remember quite fondly, although some of the extra material not overly fond of, which is the problem with the New Weird, which includes some New Weird short stories, as well as some extra material in a weird later part of the book. The next up is A People's Future of the United States, edited by Victor Laval and John Joseph Adams. I have tried this anthology a few times and I just cannot get into it, so this is probably one of the anthologies that I will be getting rid of. I also have the Locus Awards, edited by Charles N. Brown and Jonathan Strahan. So this anthology includes a number of winners of the Locus Awards over the last few years, up until the publication of this book. Also edited by Jonathan Strahan, but this time co-edited by Lou Anders, Swords and Dark Magic. So this is an anthology that publishes newer sword and sorcery. As I mentioned earlier, sword and sorcery is not perennially popular. There are some devoted readers of sword and sorcery, but there are like peaks and troughs of publication where publishers will focus a lot more on swords and sorcery than at other times. And this anthology came out, I think at the beginning or midpoint of the last trough, or not last trough, it would have been a peak in around 2010. This does have some pretty good stories in here, if I remember correctly. Next up is Universe 10, edited by Terry Carr. So this is the 10th anthology in the series that Terry Carr edited. Steve Donahue has highly recommended it, although it didn't quite work for me. Okay, it didn't work for me at all. Next is the very best of fantasy and science fiction, the 60th anniversary anthology, edited by Gordon Van Gelder. So it includes a number of short stories published in fantasy and science fiction over its first 60 years. I'm pretty sure this anthology comes out every 10 years or so. Next is New Suns, edited by Nisi Shaw. This is the first volume of this. I think there's been a second one. So this anthology features stories written by authors of color. And it's quite good. There are a number of really good stories in here, I remember correctly. And the final anthology is Tales of Terror, which I'm not entirely sure if Alfred Hitchcock actually selected these stories, or if it was his corpse. I got this anthology from my cousin. I'm assuming he must have been clearing out his library. I'm not entirely sure what his library ever looked like, but he got rid of a number of books, and his mother, during one of her trips to visit my mom, brought them to me. So I will maybe try to dip into it in May. We shall see. So that concludes the anthologies. The next two books are by Jin Yong, who is a very famous Chinese author of martial arts fantasy, wuxia. First up is Fox Volant of the Snowy Mountain, which is translated by Olivia Mock. So this is a novel set in the Qing Dynasty. It's about several groups of martial artists who end up congregating on this mountain, where a rogue is trying to gain revenge for the death of his father. I also have The Book and the Sword, which is translated by Graham Earnshaw. So I think this one features a group of martial heroes trying to kidnap the Qianlong Emperor and force him to admit that he is actually a Han Chinese rather than a Manchu. I have not read this one yet. Moving on, the next three books are by Robert E. Howard. These are the Del Rey Conan series. The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian, The Bloody Crown of Conan, and The Conquering Sword of Conan. So, Conan the Cimmerian, or Conan the Barbarian, is one of the more key characters in fantasy. I had these a long time ago when they were first coming out, and got rid of them and reacquired them about 10 or so years ago, and quite happy to still have them. These volumes not only include the stories, but also fragments of other stories that Robert E. Howard was working on that featured Conan, And also it has some illustrations, although they could have found a better artist. It would have been nice if Conan did not look like a 30-year-old or 40-year-old six-pack-a-day tobacco addict in every picture, even those that in which he is a teenager. But yeah. So I might revisit Conan in September, I don't know. Anyway, moving on. So the next two books are by Nicholas Eames, Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose. So these are the two books in the Band series. So the conceit of this series is that there are mercenary bands who, in a kitchen sink fantasy world, will be something like rock stars. So there's a constant sort of play with pop culture and rock music references to these various mercenary companies. In Kings of the Wild, an disbanded group of mercenaries reform as the group's leader's daughter has run off to join a mercenary company that is trying to defend a distant city being threatened by a horde of monsters. And so the band gets back together so that they can go rescue the daughter, who just so happens to be Bloody Rose. In Bloody Rose, her and her mercenary company are going off on a mission while everybody else is preparing to find a new horde. And things go from there. I thought Kings of the Wild was a blast when I read it back in 2017 or 2018, but I'm not terribly fond of Bloody Rose, and I have not read either one of, or reread either one of these in several years. I've never reread Kings of the Wild. So, I think it is time for them to leave. So the next two books are the first two books in the Tarot sequence by Katie Edwards. Last Sun and The Hanged Man. So the Tarot sequence is, I think, a projected series of 9 books divided into 3 trilogies. So The Last Sun is about a wizard named Rune St. John, who is the heir or pretender to the Sun Throne. So in this setting, Atlantis was a real place, and most Atlanteans were wizards. And they are organized into a noble system in which the high nobility, the ruling aristocracy, are based around the arcana of the tarot. Before The Last Sun begins, the Sun family was wiped out, leaving only Rune and his companion Brand. And so the two have found work as private detectives, mercenaries, usually working for Rune's foster father, the Tower. In The Last Sun, Rune takes in a ward himself, the heir to the Lover's Throne, which was destroyed in the prologue of the novel. And Rune is also tasked with finding a missing child of another of these houses. And then there's a conspiracy going on. I thought The Last Sun was, for the most part, amazing the first time I read it. I did have some issues. The treatment of Max, the young man that Rune and Bran take in, really pissed me off. Not only in story, but also the writing of him. And there are other things that bugged me, namely the naming conventions, which is a bit silly. And every time I have reread this book, it's been diminishing returns. And I really did not like The Hanged Man, in which Rune and company have to figure out a way to prevent the wedding of Max to the Hanged Man, one of the other Arcana, who has himself been up to a lot of shady stuff over the decades. So the third book has come out, and it came out about 2 or 3 years ago. I think I'm pretty much done with this series, so I will be sending it on its way. Next up is Witchmark by C.L. Polk. This is a gaslight fantasy about wizard shenanigans. I tried it a few years ago, really did not like what I read, bailed on it, and should have gotten rid of it last year. Unless I tried to read it last year, in which case it's now time to get rid of it. Next up is a return to K.M. Zapara. This is his second novel, First Become Ashes, in which a cult that believes through extreme acts of BDSM, they can gain magical powers. And so one of the survivors of this cult escapes this cult roundup, and alongside a young cosplayer or fan or whatever, they go on a quest to try to defeat some monsters. And I guess BDSM play comes into it. I do believe Zapara has a bit of a kink for extreme BDSM, because both this and Docile have extreme levels of BDSM kinkiness to it. Next up is Redemption Arc by Alistair Reynolds. This is one of his early novels. Have not gotten around to it yet. Debating whether or not I do want to keep it. I think I will. Next is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the first novel in a duology or trilogy. Really did not get on with it. Next up is The Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien. This is a classic of fantasy. Probably would like I think I would like a new edition of this book. But I think I will keep it. Even though I don't get on with this, no, I don't get on with The Lord of the Rings. Try as I might. Next is The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which I have not read yet. Probably should at some point. The White Mists of Power by Kristen Catherine Rush. Have not read this yet. I picked this up largely because I think for a few years Rush had a blog in which he talked about the business of writing science fiction and fantasy. The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson. This is an alternate history in which the British Empire either ceases to exist for some reason or has moved to India. I don't remember which. I'm not all that fond of Kim Stanley Robinson, though, so this one will be going. Bye-bye. The next two books are by C.L. Moore. Judgment Night and Northwest Smith. Oops. I don't think I'll be keeping either of these. I did not particularly like her Jarrell of Jewelry stories, so I don't think I want to keep those either. The next two books are by Cameron Harley. They are the first two books in the Worldbreaker saga, The Mirror Empire and Mirror Ascendant. Basically, the story is about 2 or 3 alternate dimensions and of various attempts to invade the various realities. Did not like them. And finally, the last two books on these two shelves are by Max Gladstone. 3 Parts Dead and Two Serpents Rise. So these are a series of standalone novels. I think at least these two are standalone. This first one is about a magic detective who has to figure out why God died and what the implications are of that. And then Two Serpents Rise is about another magical detective or mercenary dealing with something similar. I did not particularly care for these. So they will be going as well. So that concludes day 5 of Science Fiction and Fantasy Week. I will be back tomorrow with day 6, along with weekly read. So until then, BookTube, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.